Hello, everybody. Today, what I'd like to talk to you about are the synfuels, or the so-called synthetic fuels, as well as the issues around pipelines and the issues around fracking. And we'll touch on a few other subjects as well, such as drilling in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge in Alaska. So, get ready. Synfuels are defined by the U.S. Energy Information Administration as any fuel produced from coal or natural gas or biomass feedstocks through chemical conversions. So a feedstock is just the raw material. And they're similar to oil and gas, but they are synthesized through chemical conversion of whatever the feedback is. And they often involve feedstocks that cannot burn on their own very efficiently unless something is done to them. They're currently very expensive to produce, but as the price of petroleum rises, they will become more and more economical to produce. They are often offered as a way for the United States to gain energy independence, but they, of course, do not address the climate change issues and the carbon footprint of these energy sources, nor do they address the inevitable need to get away from using fossil fuels. And so as a result, they just keep us on the fossil fuel train. The most important synfuels can be categorized into 3 or 4 groups, some of which you've probably heard of. The first are the tar sands. These are also known as oil sands, and they are sandy sediments permeated by a substance called bitumen, and it is an oily goo, and it's usually pretty thick. And so you can't pump it in the traditional sense that you can pump petroleum. So you have to extract it by heating it using steam, and then it gets hot enough to flow, and then you can put pressure on it and it will flow. So the extraction and manufacturing requires a high energy input, and as a result, the net energy ratio of tar sands is much lower than petroleum. However, there's a lot of this junk around, and so the current estimates are that about half of the total current oil reserves that people know about are in tar sands. And you might have heard of the huge tar sand pits in northern Alberta, which some people claim is one of the biggest current environmental disasters being caused by the petroleum industry. Second are known as oil shales, and we'll talk a little bit more about these. This is oily rock. It contains a substance called kerogen, which is actually a solid organic compound found in rocks. The rock has to be crushed and heated to yield oil, and then the oil has to be refined. So once again, there is a very high energy expenditure to produce the fossil fuels. This has a very low net energy ratio, yet nevertheless people are trying to develop this as a source of fossil fuels. Next are gas hydrates. These are not currently being used, but people have realized there's a lot of natural gas locked up in permafrost, and so people are thinking about how can we get that before it escapes into the atmosphere, especially as the climate warms. And finally, there's a process called coal liquefaction, which I'm not going to talk very much about, but the whole idea is you heat coal, not to the point of burning, but you produce a liquid out of it, and you crush it, and you turn it into a liquid or gaseous fuel. It's called coal gas, and it produces much cleaner emissions when burned, but still fairly dirty. But it requires a huge energy input to produce a fossil fuel that can burn, and it once again has, therefore, a low net energy ratio. So let's look at a few of these synfuels and the issues surrounding them. So the tar sands, as I said, they're an asphalt-like oil called bitumen, must be heated to be extracted, so the net energy ratio is as low as 3, the lowest for any petroleum product. Must be refined further, just like all crude oil has to be. World reserves are huge. Most are found in Canada and Venezuela. Northern Alberta currently produces about 300 million barrels a year, which is enough to supply the United States for 15 days of consumption. The total supply is thought to be about 300 billion barrels, which is 1,000 years supply at current production level, and that would supply about 41 years of U.S. consumption. What I would recommend some of you do is Google Alberta tar sands environmental impact and look at some of the photos of what's going on there. It's pretty impressive. It's such a large site that you can actually pick it up from Google Earth if you're careful. Okay, now surrounding the tar sands is the controversy around the Keystone Pipeline, which is a pipeline that was proposed to be built from Hardisty, Alberta, right here, to coastal Texas. The pipeline already exists, but the controversy is the addition of this green part here. It's currently planned that it would travel through Montana, South Dakota, and Nebraska, and then hook up with the existing pipeline in southern Nebraska. And the pipeline is called the Keystone XL. From the United States' business point of view, one advantage of this pipeline is that light oil would be added to the heavier tar sand oil at Baker, Montana, which is why that is highlighted in blue. The pipe would have a larger diameter and would increase flow rate from the current flow rate of 590,000 barrels a day to the projected flow rate of 700,000 barrels a day, or about 16 to 20% more. The objections to the pipeline are the potential environmental damage in case of a spill. It was originally slated to go through the Nebraska Sandhills, which is a very important wildlife area, and over the Oglala Aquifer, which might have been contaminated had there been a spill. But environmentalists were successful in the rerouting of the pipeline. The big reasons that there are objections to it are listed here. First, environmentalists say, hey, it's just making it easier to distribute tar sands oil, which is incredibly environmentally destructive. We should make that stuff as expensive as possible so it's not profitable, so that oil companies will stop producing it. Second, the drop in petroleum prices due to the easy availability of tar sand oil will increase consumption of petroleum and increase greenhouse gas emissions. So once again, this will do nothing to get us off fossil fuels. And that is the third objection. It will do nothing to get us away from our fossil fuel addiction. The pipeline is often served up as a job creation program, but it will only create short-term jobs, very few long-term jobs, unless, of course, there is a major spill. And the pipeline and most of the oil is owned by a Canadian company, and it is not for domestic production. It will be almost entirely exported, and it will not do anything to reduce imports of oil. Thus, the owners of the pipeline will get to collect a fee for transporting the oil. So it really doesn't improve the U.S. energy picture very much. Next, we have the oil shales as another synthetic fuel. And these are rocks permeated with an oil-like substance that's called kerogen, not to be confused with kerosene. The rock must be crushed, heated, and it creates a huge amount of slag waste and uses a lot of energy. So now you've created a lot of greenhouse gas to make it, and it creates a lot more greenhouse gas. And then you have all this waste, which you have to do something with. Currently, it's mostly stored outdoors in open waste pits. It is currently not cost effective, but companies are looking for when it will be. And of course, if they're not forced to pay their external costs, it will be cheaper. So environmentalists are demanding that all external costs be paid up front. It has to be refined like all other petroleum products. There are large deposits in Australia, Estonia, Brazil, Sweden, the United States, and China. Reserves are about half as much as known petroleum reserves. So they think there's a lot of this still maybe that hasn't been uncovered. So I'm not going to talk about the other two synthetic fuels other than what I said earlier about them. But I wanted to go on to the idea of fracking next, because this is a technology that you may have heard about, and indeed it's a technology that is currently being deployed in Western Maryland. So we need to know what that's about. First, fracking is short for the term hydraulic fracturing. And as you can imagine, hydraulic fracturing means breaking something with water. And so what happens here is deep wells are dug and the kerogen is recovered using a high-pressured solution that is forced down into these deep wells. Let's look at how this is done. First, the drill goes down, and then it is turned horizontally into the shale, as we're going to see in the next slide. At intervals, openings are made in the bore casing, and high-pressure fluid is pumped into the rock. This fluid fractures the rock and allows the oil and gas to flow into the well, mainly gas in this case, and the gas then can be recovered because it will naturally, as it's under pressure, will come up the pipeline and can be recovered at the surface. The fluid that is used to fracture the rock is 90% water, about 9.5% sand, and the sand is interesting. That's put on there under high pressure because it basically acts like little wedges and holds the rock apart so the gas can seep out. And then 0.5% chemical additives. And let me say about these chemical additives, companies that do fracking are not required to let anybody know, to let the public know, to let the government know what are their chemical additives. This is considered a proprietary secret. And so all sorts of chemicals that are harmful to human health and are harmful to the environment can be added without any need to disclose them whatsoever. Here's the picture of what happens. So here is a well that is dug deep into the gas-bearing formation, into the shale, and then you send the pipe horizontally parallel to the ground, and then at places you open that casing up and you shoot this high-pressure water, and it cracks the rock and the gas flows out. So then all this water that's under pressure comes back up too, and you have to have wastewater pond. You also have to capture the gas as it comes out. The environmental concerns with fracking, as you can already imagine. In fact, you might want to turn off the video and just write down your top 3 guesses as to what the environmental concerns would be. Okay, hopefully you've done that and you're back. So let's look. Number 1 is the risk of contamination to groundwater, right? If we go back and we look at the last slide, you can see that there are several aquifers in many cases that the well has gone through. So what you're hoping is that none of the chemicals, none of the gas have gotten into these aquifers, which everybody who's living over here and over here and over here is pulling up for their water. The second, the depletion of groundwater, because those drills are using a huge amount of it. And since a source that's drawing groundwater will draw groundwater from a huge area underneath it, people and municipalities that have wells dug may find themselves needing to drill new wells, new, deeper wells. Third, the polluted wastewater. Where should it be put? One solution is to inject it back deep into the earth, but this is going to lubricate existing faults and allow them to slip, causing earthquakes, increased seismic activity. And you may think, okay, that's absurd. How can drilling for gas create more earthquakes? Well, if you were to pick a place in the United States as the least earthquakey place, you might pick Oklahoma in the Central Great Plains. But Oklahoma has allowed so much fracking that now Oklahoma is one of the most seismically active states in the United States. And what has the Oklahoma government and what has private industry suggested for Oklahoma homeowners and business owners and city dwellers? They've said, buy earthquake insurance. That's what they're saying. In other words, they're taking no responsibility for this. We will read an article in class about the increased seismic activity in Oklahoma. It's noisy, so if you live around it, it's really unpleasant. The noise travels long distances, and it is really smelly. All sorts of chemicals come up. So there's a lot of external costs for people who live locally. And then there are all the health risks associated with the low levels of natural gas that leak, other air pollutants that come out of the ground, or the contamination, let me say, of well water with toxins. And fracking is the fundamental reason for the rapid decrease in the price of natural gas. And thus, once again, it hinders the conversion to low greenhouse gas energy technologies. Many environmentalists see fracking as a way to transition us away from coal and oil by using the relatively cleaner natural gas to fire all our fossil fuel fired devices. But once again, the companies who are drilling this stuff don't see it that way. They see it as a way to make a quick profit, and they're not going to do anything to get us off natural gas. I thought I would point out to you how large the formation called the Marcellus Shale is. This is the formation that contains the natural gas. There are huge deposits in this sedimentary rock that is buried below New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Maryland, West Virginia, and Virginia. As we said earlier, you cannot extract it unless fracking technology is used. Each state regulates fracking in its own way, and there is almost no requirement for companies to report much about their practices. New York has led the way in banning fracking altogether, but Pennsylvania and West Virginia allow it. Maryland is in the process of allowing it in Western Maryland only, and I believe that's already happened. And that makes sense because Western Maryland, the 3 counties of Western Maryland, are the only places where the Marcellus Shale occurs, as you will see in the map here. Here's the Marcellus Shale. You can see it starts in New York. It's out over Lake Erie here. It's in eastern Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, parts of Virginia. And here it is in Western Maryland. That's the Marcellus Shale. Finally, what I want to do is talk to you a little bit about the controversy over drilling for oil in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is in the northeast corner of Alaska, on the north slope, on the shores of the Arctic Ocean. The wildlife is so abundant here in summer that it has often been called America's Serengeti. To its west is the National Petroleum Reserve, which was developed in the 1970s and which spawned the creation of the Alaska Pipeline, which travels from Prudhoe Bay all the way down to Valdez, which is where the Exxon Valdez was loaded before it crashed here in Prince William Sound. Every few years, the desire to drill in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge will be a renewed battle that faces Congress. So let's talk about this and why it's so controversial. There's always been pressure to allow drilling here because there's oil there. After the Exxon Valdez spill, no one dared propose drilling in the refuge, and so it was considered a dead-in-the-water issue. But as time passed, it has come up again and again. By 1994, the U.S. was importing more than half its oil. Calls for drilling in the refuge resurfaced once again. And the Senate and the House passed bills allowing drilling, but Bill Clinton vetoed them. And so once again, it died at that point. The pro-drilling argument is that it will support economic development, that it would help make the U.S. less dependent on foreign oil, that the infrastructure is already in place at Prudhoe Bay, that the Prudhoe Bay oil field production is waning. It peaked in 1985, which is why the oil companies want to move into the refuge. The anti-drilling argument is as follows. This will continue to expand production of fossil fuels, making them cheaper, and therefore it prolongs the avoidance of doing what we know is necessary. A U.S. Fish and Wildlife study shows that oil exploration in the western end of the North Slope, which is where the petroleum reserve is, has significantly reduced populations of large animals such as wolves and grizzly bears and caribou and muskox. The tundra cannot be restored quickly after drilling because the tundra grows very slowly. There's a very short growing season. There are very low levels of primary productivity. So the damage is very long term. So that is it for our coverage of synthetic fuels, pipelines, and fracking and other controversial energy sources. Let me just say in closing that I think our study of energy has shown the following. The science has shown us that climate change is real and that it is occurring a lot faster than people were predicting it would occur, even as recently as 30 years ago. We also know, the science is pretty clear, that we will run out of fossil fuels relatively soon. Prices will start to go up within this century, and certainly we have no more than 1,000 years of fossil fuels left to use. These two things mean that humans will have to develop strategies for energy that do not add greenhouse gases to the atmosphere and that are not damaging to the environment and do not endanger human health. The continued development of low-grade fossil fuel resources, such as the synthetic fuels we talked about in this video, postpones the date at which we make that decision and worsens the effect of climate change and gets us ever close to the climate change tipping point. We've also seen in this unit that we already have all the technologies we need to develop a safe, secure, and reliable energy system, one that is based on renewable energy. The conclusion, therefore, of this unit seems pretty obvious to me about what we as human beings should be doing in the next year, the next decade, and the next 50 years. I'll leave you to think about what your opinion is on that issue. Until next time, think hard about climate change and our energy future. Also, at the end of this PowerPoint presentation, there will be a list of videos that we have seen in class, and maybe even some that we haven't seen in class, that you can feel free to take a look at.